So greetings everyone. Welcome to the CSEP dialogue between Spencer Dale, Chief Economist, BP, and Montek Ahluwalia, Distinguished Fellow, CSEP. I am Laveesh Bhandari, a Senior Fellow at CSEP, moderating what promises to be a very interesting and insightful discussion on a very challenging topic. Energy is a key component of the growth process, but with its multidimensional impacts on the environment, it's become even more important from a policy perspective. So today we have with us two key personalities who have been at the center of policy making in both their countries and now devote the substantial intellect to the issues of energy transition and how to go about it. I'll first introduce Mr. Spencer Dale, Chief Economist, BP. As the Chief Economist, he manages BP's Economics and Energy Insights team, which provides advice and analysis on the global energy system, the energy transition, and the evolving nature of energy systems as it moves to net zero. Before joining BP as the Chief Economist in October 2014, he has held key positions at the Bank of England as the Chief Economist, member of the Monetary Policy Committee, Executive Director of the Financial Stability, member of Financial Policy Committee. He has served as a senior advisor at the US Federal Reserve Board of Governors between 2006 and 8. Educated at University of Wales, where he got a BSc in economics, and also at University of Warwick, where he had an MSc in economics in '89. Mr. Montek Ahluwalia, Distinguished Fellow, CSEP. He's a well-known economist and a civil servant. He was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Government of India. He joined the government in 1979 as the economic advisor, and after that has held a series of positions. And I will pick and choose: Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, Finance Secretary, member of the Planning Commission, and member of the Economic Advisory Council. He has also been a director at the Independent Evaluation Office of the International Monetary Fund. He's got two books on the Indian economy. On the economy. First was Growth: An Approach to Policy in '75. And many years later, the story behind India's high growth years, an insider's account of policy making. In 2011, he was awarded India's second most highest civilian award, Padma Vibhushan. He has studied at Delhi University and the University of Oxford. So, Mr. Spencer Dale, I'd request you to start with your talk, and then later we'll continue the conversation based on that. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Laveesh. Thank you, CSEP, for this invitation. And it's a great honor to share the platform with Dr. Ahluwalia, who I think of as a father of Indian economics. So it's a great honor, sir, to share a platform with you. And it's a great honor to be back in India. I travel to India once or twice a year, every year since joining BP until the pandemic. And so it's great to be back, partly because it's such an amazing country to visit, but also if you want to understand energy, you want to understand global energy, you have to understand what's happening here in India. And I think the only way you can do that, you can't do that via Zoom calls, you have to come and meet people and understand things. So it's wonderful to be back. We're going to talk about BP's energy outlook. We published this in March. Unfortunately, more or less all of the scenarios that were in there were out of date at the point that we published them. We produced the scenarios largely before the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, I think, the one thing we know for certain, I think, will change the world in a very profound way. And so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time thinking through those scenarios. I want to do two things today. First, I want to use the scenarios to help provide a backdrop, a context for some of the climate aims and goals that India have announced recently, many of which Prime Minister Modi announced at COP26 last year in Glasgow. So how should we think about those, and can I use the scenarios as a prism for thinking about those? And then I want to say a little bit about how we're starting to think about the war in Ukraine and how it may change global energy for the future. And hopefully that's enough provocation to start a discussion. So that's the plan. Let me just introduce the three scenarios. So when we're developing our energy outlook, we developed a series of scenarios to use as a frame of reference. Very briefly, the green new momentum scenario is designed to give a sense about the pathway the global energy system is moving along at the moment. Over the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in global ambition in terms of trying to address climate change. If I went back to 2019, less than 20% of the world's carbon emissions were covered by net zero pledges. Today, over 90% of the world's carbon emissions are covered by zero emission pledges. So there is some momentum in terms of action on climate change, which is why we call this new momentum, but nowhere near enough. So carbon emissions in this scenario don't peak until the late 2020s, and they only decline by around 20% by 2050. So way short in terms of what is needed to achieve the Paris climate goals. The other two scenarios consider far faster, deeper decarbonisation scenarios, the accelerated and net zero. Both of those are consistent with meeting the Paris climate goals. You can think of accelerated, and we do lots of analysis in the book to explain how we come to this conclusion. Accelerated is consistent with a pathway in which temperatures rises are contained to well below 2 degrees C, and net zero consistent with maintaining temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. And you can think of these two scenarios as sort of what-if scenarios. So what would need to happen in the energy system if the world wanted to reduce carbon emissions by around 75% by 2050 in the case of accelerated, or by around 95% in net zero. Now the key point to stress is all of these scenarios will be wrong. We can't predict the future. We know we can't predict the future. The value of scenarios, in my mind, isn't to try to predict the future. It's designed to help to explore the range of uncertainty you face. Once you have a sense of that range of uncertainty, then you can then start to think about how, as a company like BP, or as a policymaker in India, how you can set policy which is robust or resilient to that range of uncertainty. So this is sort of standard decision making under uncertainty. You explore the range of uncertainty, you then try to pick strategies or rules which are robust and resilient to that type of uncertainty. So that's how we use the strategies in BP. This is for the global energy system. What's the implication? And we then do this is built up from doing the same scenarios across countries and regions. So the corresponding scenarios for India look like this chart here, so they're exactly the same colours. So the new momentum scenario is, despite carbon intensity of the Indian energy system improving, that sheer growth of economic growth and increasing prosperity, driving increases in energy, means that the new momentum, carbon emissions continue to rise and more or less double over the next 30 years. In contrast, in accelerated and net zero, they fall by between 25% and 70% respectively. So the first question I wanted to say is, well, how do these scenarios relate to some of the aims and ambitions that India has discussed and talked about in recent months, including Prime Minister Modi's 5 aims he outlined at the Glasgow Climate Conference. So the first, one of the aims that the Prime Minister identified was that a reduction in projected emissions of 1 billion tonnes by 2030. The trouble with that, trying to understand what that meant as a statement, is it's a reduction in projected emissions, but you don't know what the baseline is. So it's quite hard to then work out how to put a dot on my chart to work out what that means. However, he also had another ambition, which was to reduce carbon intensity by 45% by 2030 relative to 2005. So from that, I can work out what the desired level of carbon intensity is in 2030. I multiply that by GDP, and that would give me a level of carbon. which is around 34 gigatons by 2030. If anybody knows a better approximation of that, I'm very happy to be corrected. One of the joys of coming out and speaking to people is you learn better. But that's sort of a 25% increase from now, but clearly below where you would be if you were on that new momentum type pathway. The other, and perhaps the most significant announcement that the Prime Minister made at Glasgow was a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. My scenarios finish at 2050, so I can't really talk about that. But what I have done here, I've just extrapolated them forward in a sort of straight line. So I haven't done anything sophisticated here. I've just assumed that that pace of improvement continues in a straight line. And we didn't do this by design. I only drew this chart a week ago before coming to India, so we hadn't done this before. But you can see the accelerated line pretty much hits net zero by 2070. So if it's sort of backward induction, if somebody said what scenario most equates to India's recent objectives, that accelerated pathway, which is consistent with Paris, well below 2, not a 1.5, it seems as good approximation as any. If we then just look a little bit more at some of those scenarios, just to sort of get a sense about how to think about them. So first of all, that objective to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. What I've done here in the chart on the left, if I put that 45% number in the red bar, so that's the target, and then what I've done is compared that target with what the implied implications are for my 3 scenarios. You can see I'm quite colour obsessed, so the colours are still the same. So the green is new momentum, accelerated is orange, net zero is blue, and the dark blue here is sort of history. And you can see that 45% is roughly somewhere, is sort of pretty much in line with accelerated, which is what we just saw on the previous chart in some sense. They're just a different way of presenting the same data. I think perhaps what is more interesting is a chart on the right, which says, what's the average rate of improvement do I need to see in carbon intensity sort of over the period 2020 to 2030 to achieve this objective? And I need an average rate of improvement in carbon intensity of around 3.5% a year. That compares with the past 10 years of an average rate of improvement of about 2% a year. So I'm building into this pathway quite a significant acceleration in the rate of improvement in carbon intensity. If you think, well, how do I achieve that rate of improvement in carbon intensity? A critical component driving that improvement in carbon intensity is the growth of non-fossil fuels. And so Prime Minister Modi also had a commitment to, or an aim to achieve 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030. What I've done here is that 500 gigawatts was in terms of all non-fossil fuels, so it includes hydro, it includes nuclear. So what I've done here is drawn a target for 450 gigawatts in terms of wind and solar. And I think if you crawl through the footnotes of various speeches, you can see 450 gigawatts of wind and solar is not a bad approximation. And you can see, again, that's pretty much in between net zero and accelerated. Again, I think perhaps the more instructive chart is the chart on the right-hand side. So to get that sort of pathway, you need roughly about 40 gigawatts a year increase in capacity. So it's simple arithmetic. Thus far, from history to today, India has achieved about 100 gigawatts of capacity of wind and solar. So it needs to achieve 350 in less than 10 years. So you need to do about 40 gigawatts a year. On average, over the last 5 years, it's done less than 10 gigawatts. The most it's ever done in history is around 12 gigawatts, which was last year. So you need to sort of triple the rate of build out from next year every year. And so the challenge is can we make sure that we have the right policy incentives, the right structures to achieve that significant increase in wind and solar. Perhaps the final chart I want to look at is more recently, the government has announced a target to achieve 5 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030. Now, for many of us, hydrogen is a new energy vector. We're not used to even thinking the units, so it may not be immediately apparent how big a number 5 million tonnes is. Perhaps one way of describing that ambition is to look about that relative to what we had built into our scenarios. So you can see remember those scenarios are that accelerated and net zero, pretty ambitious scenarios in terms of decarbonisation, in line with what the government was thinking about in terms of carbon intensity, wind and solar. But you can see here the pathway for hydrogen, so 4 or 5 times greater than anything that we had built into our pathways. Now, I think the message here, we'd produced these scenarios before the hydrogen strategy was developed. So this is not meant as a comment on the hydrogen pathway. It's more meant as a sort of an illustration of just the degree of ambition that is underpinning that hydrogen target. And I think that ambition raises potential challenges on both sides. The challenge on one side is generating enough renewable energy to produce that green hydrogen, and that's a significant amount of renewable energy. And on the demand side is finding ways in which that hydrogen can be incorporated, particularly within the industrial sector, without leading to either higher costs or higher prices in terms of energy prices faced by households, or affecting the competitiveness of Indian industry. And so I think that's one of the challenges going forward. So that's a very quick summary of using my scenarios to think about what's happening in terms of those Indian, the most recent targets posed and set by the Indian government. Just one other thing to sort of say was, okay, so all my scenarios are wrong. They're always wrong, but they're even worse than normal, because I think the war in Ukraine, the actions of Russia have changed many things. How may the world evolve? Well, it's obviously the war is still going on, so it's far too early to say. But just to sort of some of the things that I have in our minds, or we have in our minds, and we're trying to think about what this world may do. So one is, obviously, we have an extraordinarily challenging economic environment. In the near term, the nature of the shocks to food and energy prices have led to a stagflationary shock. So a stagflationary shock, a shock which both pushes up prices and slows growth simultaneously. Those increasing prices are now causing central banks around the world to tighten monetary policy far more aggressively than they had previously expected to do, which in itself will then reinforce some of this drag on growth. So we face a very near-term, very challenging set of circumstances. And I think potentially, if we see the impact of the war in Ukraine lead to a more fragmented world, a world of less integration, shorter supply chains, we could see a world where that less integration leads to less trade and a sort of world which will lead to sort of slower economic growth over time. So both a near-term issue, but also potentially a longer-term issue, is this leads to sort of less globalization, less integration, less international trade. I think the obvious next issue is a very significant increase in energy security in terms of people's concerns about ensuring the security of the energy that they need to use. I think what energy security means is likely to vary across different countries and regions. So for a region like the European Union, which I live very close to, I think energy security means trying to achieve a diversified range of politically stable energy providers. Clearly, the EU had failed in terms of its current energy stance in both of those places. It wasn't diversified, and its main source of energy wasn't politically stable. I think for other parts of the world, energy security may well mean energy self-sufficiency. And I think, and that will have implications for the nature of energy trade going forward. And I know that one of the long-term aims of the Indian government is to achieve energy self-sufficiency by 2047. I think we're also likely to see countries focus on sources of energy which are locally produced. An important part of that is all non-fossil fuels, so wind, solar, bio, hydrogen, hydro, nuclear, all of those sorts of energy tend to be produced and consumed almost exclusively locally. So I think it's likely to lead to a boost in terms of those non-fossil fuels because they're a natural source of energy security. And I also think it's likely to lead to an increased investment around the world into forms of energy security. So diversity, increasing storage, increasing capacity. I think the message for that for governments is that energy security is a public good. It's not provided by private markets on its own, so it will need to ensure, the governments will need to ensure that energy security is provided. I think for the world, that energy security will act as an additional cost. And so we can think of the cost of energy, average cost of energy rising over time to reflect that energy security. And for a company like BP, I think there's a challenge for us as how can we respond to that need for energy security in terms of the energy services that we provide. In terms of oil and gas prices, as you know, oil and gas prices have increased very substantially over the last 3 or 6 months. My instinct is that that increase in oil and gas prices we may persist for a significant period of time, and the simple intuition underpinning that type of assumption is just that if, as seems likely at the moment, a significant amount of the energy supplies that Russia used to provide to the world are lost to the market in one form or another, that shortage of energy will lead to a protracted rise in prices until we get both dampen demand, but also incentivize alternative new sources of supply. And for oil, natural gas, LNG, refining, that new supply will take multiple years to come on stream. My question is whether, perhaps in the longer term, the question mark in my mind is whether it may lead to a sort of more challenging environment for oil and gas demand over the longer term. And that simply reflects this issue of energy security. So, as this audience will know far better than I, today India imports around 75% of its oil and around 50% of its gas. China has similar levels of import dependence. When you do long-term scenarios, energy scenarios like we do, all of the growth in oil and gas is coming from fast-developing emerging economies, particularly here in Asia. If those economies start to be more concerned about energy security and substitute away from imported oil and imported gas to domestically produced energy, that may well constrain some of that longer-term demand for oil and gas. And I guess the final point here is in terms of some of the other effects. I talked about the impact it may have on globalization. I guess the other sort of imponderable here is how might this affect the speed of the energy transition. I think there are some grounds for optimism. This sort of the increased focus on non-fossil fuels may help to support that energy transition. Perhaps also is an increased focus on energy efficiency. The most secure form of energy security is energy efficiency, so you don't have to consume that energy. Both of those are essential ingredients to a successful energy transition. But on the other side, we have a whole series of headwinds developed by the war in Ukraine in terms of people focusing on energy security, their focus shifting on the resilience of their energy system, trying to ensure their economies recover from the very significant shocks to food and energy prices. And the danger is the urgency associated with the energy transition. It pushes down the agenda for a few years. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, on energy producers like BP and on prestigious think tanks like CSEP to keep reminding the world that we can't afford to lose 5 years in terms of the energy transition. We need to keep the urgency associated with that energy transition. And hopefully, if we can see and find policies which achieve both greater energy security but also greater energy sustainability in the same way. And so I think that's at the same time. So I think that's our challenge that we face going forward. Laveesh, let me stop there and turn it back to you. Thank you.
You're absolutely on schedule. Mr. Ahluwalia, I'd like you to start your first thoughts on the presentation and also views.
Well, is this working? Yeah. I really enjoyed that and learned something. I did actually. I'm a little fascinated by what you didn't present, because it would be nice to see what the world would have looked like if Ukraine and so on hadn't happened. Maybe I'll look at it later on. You know, I think you've been very cautious in indicating there are huge amounts of uncertainty. And of course, we are right now in India looking at what the prospects are for achieving our objectives, which have been laid out. And you know, they do, whichever way you look at it, they do involve a massive energy transition. And we've done a paper for CSEP, which sort of brings out some of the aspects of that transition. And you know, I don't think it's adequately understood in how many areas we will have to change in order to achieve the kind of transformation that we're talking about. I mean, it's quite clear the technology is there. It doesn't solve all the problems, certainly on green hydrogen. I mean, there's a lot of corporate statements that we're going to cut the cost of production by whatever, from $5 a kg to $1 a kg. Wonderful if it happens. But you know, in this whole area, probably we have to assume that the technology change that did occur in the last 10 years, which actually changed the whole perspective on what is possible, might in fact continue. I don't think the Ukraine war alters that. I mean, if anything, the general concern globally that everybody should reduce their carbon footprints should lead to a lot more research in these areas, and hopefully we can piggyback on that. But you know, we have huge internal challenges, because whichever way you look at the Indian transition, I mean, you're of course anchoring it on, this is really anchored on oil and gas. We are sort of at the dirty end of the spectrum, which is coal. So compared to that, oil and gas is a lot better. But you know, we need to cut down both. And I don't know, we set a target of 2017 net zero. Most experts looking at what different countries have committed in COP26 come to the conclusion that it ain't good enough. And in fact, COP26 said that they were referring to COP27, urging countries to try and improve their own emissions reduction trajectories so that we could do better. Now, I haven't seen any reaction. I think one or two countries have suggested that they will do better. One of the big things, quite honestly, internationally on this is that are the advanced countries willing to accept that they should do better than the 2050 that they've promised? I mean, of course, there's another issue. That is, they may say that, but we know that just as things are difficult for us, it's going to be quite difficult for them to implement that when it gets to the actual stage of implementation. I saw something yesterday, and maybe you can explain to us. I think a court in the UK has said that the UK plans for emissions reductions, when you look at them from a granular point of view, don't add up to what they should. Now, what the importance of this is, I don't know. I mean, does it in any way compel the government to respond and say we're going to do more? I think one of the difficult things we will face, quite honestly, is that politics revolves around cheap energy prices. You know, politics, certainly in India, probably in many countries, revolves around cheap energy prices. Whereas a lot of what we are finding is that if we're going to achieve the transition we're talking about, we have to get out of low electricity prices in our various distribution companies. We probably have to impose some kind of a carbon tax. And the need for this carbon tax is that much greater because the transition we're talking about is going to involve more public investment, certainly in certain types of energy infrastructure, transmission, etc. It'll involve a lot more investment in adaptation, which we haven't been doing before. And as we phase out of both coal and diesel and petrol, there's going to be a loss of revenues. And I think Laveesh has done a lot of very good work on that. So if you look at all of this put together, to my mind, it's an overwhelming case for having a carbon tax. But the moment you raise that issue, nobody thinks it's a good idea. So there's a huge gap between doing things in practice, which will bring us to the transition we want, and the political constraints that governments face. Now, remember, this is a long-term transition. I mean, we're talking about somewhere 2050, maybe 2060 for some countries. And it is unfortunate that we're doing it at a time when the short-run energy price system seems hopelessly in disarray. If one could conclude that the Russia-Ukraine problem is a short-run problem, then one could say, well, we'll somehow take care of the current year, get back to normal. I find that very few people are willing to say that either. Even if it takes a couple of years to get back to normal, it's still a very long term. But you know, the next 2 or 3 years will, so to speak, set the tone for what happens later. And I don't know whether you'd like to comment, for example, in the United States, they're going through a they have an election coming at the end of this year, and then a presidential election 2 years later. Is there any willingness to take any of these hard decisions, which would bring about the decarbonisation that they've promised?
Many points there. So let me just respond to a few of them. I guess often whenever you start talking about the energy transition and climate change, the conversation can become very depressing very quickly. So I guess one point of hope, or one ground for optimism, perhaps, to start with, which is the technology we need to get to net zero exists today. We know how to decarbonise the energy system. A combination of wind, solar, bio, and hydrogen is sufficient to get the world to net zero. So we don't need some laboratory breakthrough. The challenge isn't a technology challenge, it's a scaling challenge. We just need to scale those technologies rapidly across the world at huge pace and at huge scale. That in itself, I think we've seen from renewables, will massively help to reduce the cost of those technologies as we just have mass manufacturing and we do learn by doing. So we know how to do this. We don't need huge technology breakthroughs, we just need the will to do it. As Dr. Ahluwalia said, from an economic textbook, we know what the right policy. The right policy is carbon pricing. We are fully supportive in BP of carbon pricing. We have been for many, many years, and the economic case for carbon pricing is clear. What I'm slightly nervous about is the political case for carbon pricing is not clear. Now, you could, and we can see that governments around the world, in large part, have not been willing to impose carbon prices at the levels you need to see. I think the European Union is one notable exception, where we're seeing now carbon prices touching 100 euros a tonne, or have been touching 100 euros a tonne. Now, one could argue, we just need to make the case for carbon pricing to politicians. They just haven't understood it yet. My guess is politicians are pretty smart people. I think they understand what these things are. I think the politics of carbon pricing isn't very, is often not very attractive. And I think my own personal view, and this is a personal view, is we could spend the next few years trying to persuade politicians. We haven't got a few years to waste in terms of carbon pricing. So my sense would be pretty pragmatic. If I can get more action more quickly by holding my nose and doing different forms of regulation, I'll hold my nose and do different forms of regulation. I know it's second best relative to carbon pricing, but second best regulation may be better than very low carbon pricing. I think your point about what needs to happen in terms of the energy transition in one form or other is we need to change the relative prices between fossil fuel prices and non-fossil fuel prices. Carbon prices is one way of doing that. huge improvements in technology and rollout will allow costs of non-fossil fuels to decline. So increasingly, I think even here in India, if you do a horse race between renewables, solar and coal, increasingly that solar will win. And so and so that's encouraging. We can hopefully achieve some of it the other way. And I guess perhaps one other final grounds of optimism in terms of the Ukraine war. For many politicians, I think trying to push through very radical policies for climate change is a difficult thing to do, because there's no sort of urgency that I must do this by next year. This is not like the pandemic where I can take very significant interventions. And in some sense, it's not like the energy security risks that we face now. And I wonder if governments around the world can take the urgency associated with energy security and try to build a set of policies around that. So an example would be, if you look in Japan and what happened post the Fukushima disaster, there was a national campaign for energy efficiency. That changed social norms. And today, still now, energy intensity levels are significantly lower than they were before. You changed people's attitude towards energy. And in some sense, to achieve the energy transition, we need to change people's attitudes towards energy and the entitlement to that energy. I know many people in India do not have that entitlement. Many people in the West have that entitlement squared. And I think we need to try and if we can use this as an opportunity to try to change that norms and try to take energy efficiency seriously, that may be perhaps a silver lining in terms of the horrendous events that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine at the moment. Sorry, that's a very long answer to some of your points.
I have a question. I was quite surprised when you said that there is really no technological challenge. Now, if there really is no technological challenge, then it's not a problem at all. It's essentially the problem. The way I see it is, it's a cost issue, and you do need to invest far more simply because of that. Otherwise, the markets will take care of it. And related to that, when you build in storage technologies, that's when the costs do tend to go haywire. So, any thoughts on that? I mean,
so I don't disagree. I think this is, to a very large extent, the challenge is one of a social and political will to drive through these new these technologies, low carbon energy sources and low carbon energy vectors. We know that relative to a counterfactual in which climate change didn't exist, that will have some costs. Relative to the real in which climate change does exist, and it's growing all the time. And I sit here today making this statement where for the first time ever, I sit in Delhi where the temperatures in London are hotter than in Delhi. So if you ever want a concrete example of climate change, there's a concrete example of climate change. And so we need the political and social will to drive those things through. And in terms of the costs of climate change, just enormously cost efficient to drive these changes through and to do it as quickly as we can. But I think you're right. And I think some of that in the West is a political and social will. I think for economies like India, I think the onus is on the West to deliver on the climate financing that they've promised and thus far not delivered. And I think asking countries, my fact I carry around, and it's a glib fact, but it's I think quite a powerful one, is an average American consume 10 or 12 times more energy than an average Indian. So why, when we're talking about climate change, do we start at India? And so the need for the West to try and support that rollout both in their own countries, but also to provide climate finance, I think, for the developing world, I think is critically important. But I think it is, ultimately, it's a political and social will issue. It's not a technology issue. We can do this if we want to do it.
I mean, a lot of people, when they think of technology, sort of have in mind that the technology exists to switch at current prices. Okay. I think what Laveesh is saying is that's not so. Because if you take into account the intermittency problem, and you can mitigate it here and there, the only way you can balance supply and demand is a huge investment in batteries. You don't actually have batteries on that scale yet. We don't know, by the way, whether mere scale factors will lead to a sufficient fall in cost, because there are materials, etc., which are scarce. So if you factor all that in, basically, we can technically generate a matched supply of renewable energy with demand. We can probably moderate the demand by having price variations, within day price variations, so on. All of which, by the way, in India, we haven't even started educating people on the need for that. But it's a big change, so it will take some time. But I do think the bottom line really is, both in here and elsewhere, energy has got to become more expensive, otherwise people will not live with less energy. And as you say, I think the politicians understand the economics. But who was it, I think, in the European Union who said, it's not that we don't know what to do, it's just that we don't know how to get re-elected.
And I think I agree, and I think what we've observed in the last year is quite sober in that respect, in the sense that we've seen fossil fuel prices rise, oil, gas and coal prices rise essentially as a result of the war. And then we've seen governments around the world immediately respond to that by introducing various forms of subsidies, because the political cost of high energy prices is very high. To achieve this energy transition, we certainly need to change the relative prices. Whether absolute prices need to rise is less clear to me, but I think we need to also invest heavily in energy efficiency. But I think we need to do that really importantly in a just and equitable way. And I think that just and equitable way within a country is making sure that that burden, if there are higher energy prices, is borne by higher, more wealthy families who are more able to bear it, and lower income families are supported in that way. But they're supported in an efficient way, not by subsidising the energy they produce, but by giving them lump sum subsidies of one form or another, but still those relative prices shift. So that's, I think, within country, and then across the globe, that the wealthier nations support in terms of climate finance, emerging market economies who are still going through the industrial phase, whose energy consumption per capita is tiny relative to those developed worlds, whose carbon emissions per capita is tiny relative to that developed world. So I think having a sort of this just and equitable frame in terms of that energy transition is critical if we're going to keep the social legitimacy for the energy transition, and without that social legitimacy, we will never be successful.
But the numbers on that are very reassuring. I mean, you mentioned the global issue of helping developing countries cope. Lord Stern, who was actually here, sitting where you're sitting only about 10 days ago, he's been doing a lot of work along with Amar Bhattacharya. But what I gather from their work is, this is apparently not. What I gather from Nick's work with Amar is that whereas the current commitment to provide financial support is $100 billion annually, which was supposed to be reached in 2020, it hasn't been reached. They now think, well, maybe we'll get there in 2024. And in COP26, it was made very clear that we have to go beyond that. But now, how much beyond that? If you believe what Lord Stern is saying, this 100 billion may have to go to 1 trillion, if not more. Now, I think if it happens, that'll be fantastic. But we need to imagine what will happen if there isn't a comparable response. Now, this is where obviously the Ukraine-Russia, the Russian invasion has created a very unusual situation and is probably occupying virtually all the mind space of the global leadership. That's why I said that, we just don't know how long that'll last. But even if it wasn't there, it's not clear that there will be a political response on the scale that he's talking about. Now, by the way, this 1 trillion doesn't have to be public. It's a combination of public and private. And the good news, of course, is that most developing countries are quite willing to see private money come in. But, our view is that given the uncertainties in the energy sector, while some of the investment needed, for example, in electric vehicles and that sort of stuff, will get done by the private sector, because these are really the upper income groups which can afford somehow to pay for the change. A lot of it will really have to be done by the states, by distribution companies, and the kind of reforms that will be needed to attract private sector to support, to make investments may need to be lubricated, according to Professor Stern and Bhattacharya, by a significant increase in other kinds of long-term public capital, maybe multilateral development banks. And they talk about multilateral development bank lending sort of being trebled in the next 2 years, not in the long term, and increasing further beyond that. So do you think there's something in the politics of the situation that is pushing people in that direction?
Yeah, so we've all sat at Nick's feet and learnt Nick Stern's feet and learnt an awful lot, and as always, he speaks a lot of sense. So I agree entirely. The 100 billion is a small amount of money relative to what is needed, and it's a shame that the Western governments the developed world haven't been able to achieve that. My instinct is the only way we're going to finance the energy transition has to be by liberalising private capital flows. And the good news is I think the nature of changing investor sentiment in the West is demanding that Western financial institutions invest in a way which is sustainable. So there's a huge wall of money which wishes to invest in the energy transition, and it's finding a way of doing that. But it's still, I've been speaking since I've been in India, and you speak to investors, sort of developers here in wind and solar, and you say, what are some of the constraints holding you back? That cost of capital remains a very significant issue. And remember, wind and solar are very highly capital intensive projects, so that cost of capital matters a lot. So my instinct is a absolutely critical element of a successful energy transition will be some form of blended finance between multilateral development banks, providing some sort of credit wrap, guarantee wrap, which allows the external finance to flow. And I think my instinct is that needs to be a critical source of sort of focus over the next few years, is using the loss-bearing ability of public sector balance sheets, multilateral balance sheets, but also the credibility enhancement the multilateral balance sheets can provide to provide various forms of blended finance, which then facilitates this flow of private sector investment into projects. So I think, again, I sort of don't wish to be overly optimistic, but I think we know how to do blended finance, right? I mean, we've been doing this for many years in different forms. This is not rocket science. Again, if there's a will to achieve this, the resources of the multilateral development banks, because you don't have to put in huge sums of capital if you provide in the right way in terms of first credit losses and so on, could potentially allow far bigger flows of private finance to flow into the developing world.
Mr. Ahluwalia, I have a question for you on the blended finance aspect, as given especially from an Indian perspective, where the government till now hasn't really shown any interest in going this route. Do you foresee that the government embracing this concept? And
well, I mean, I can't speak for the government.
Yeah, of course, but in India,
I'm not aware that the government has actually said we're not interested in blended finance. I think governments very rarely sort of shoot in the dark. So I think it's up to the multilateral development banks, and I know they've set up groups come forward with some kind of proposals. Nick and Amar have been working on them quite a bit. In some sense, either the G7 or the G20 or something come up with a package saying, look, this is how we're going to respond to the need for financing. I think they will immediately get a response. Janet Yellen said the right thing, because she said some months ago, they're talking of billions when we need trillions. And then she said, well, we have to reform the Bretton Woods institutions. That I read that as saying that, look, we're not prepared to put money in the existing system with no change. Come up with something innovative, and we're willing to consider it. Now, if that were to happen, and then they were to say, well, look, here's a way we can do it, then I think the government would respond. It's true that I don't think the government has itself come forward with a proposal, but I don't think that they would turn it down if something like that were to happen.
Globally, have you seen any movements in this front? I mean, because what we tend to see in India is that we don't see these offers coming in, at least even on a minor scale, really.
No, I think it's well documented. Many people far more knowledgeable than I am and in far more important positions than I have thus far sort of criticised that it's not happening. I think one significant development that happened at the Glasgow COP26, was the creation of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. That is a huge amount of money under investment, which is committed to investing into the energy transition. And my impression is that the GFANZ are working hard to think about what forms blended finance can take. So I think this is watch this space, and I hope that we will see sort of developments in this, because it feels to me that it's the billions versus trillions point. And governments can provide billions, they can't provide trillions, but private finance can provide trillions. And investing in, if you think about India in terms of the cost of the competitiveness of solar energy here, the enormous growth market we will see here in terms of power demand, why would you not want to invest here? Right? This is an extraordinarily positive market with sort of exponential growth rates. So intuitively, there must be investment opportunities here to be had in providing clean energy for a world of population which is growing in both size and in prosperity.
But I think, in India, one of the things the government has done, which actually I think is quite sensible to start off with, is they've insulated the investors who are investing in generation from the payments risk of distribution companies that aren't viable by providing some kind of a centrally endorsed guarantee that if you don't get paid for the Solar Electricity, whatever, Corporation of India actually invites bids. It's done on a basis which they can defend was reasonable, and then the winning bids can then be allocated to various state governments. The central government, in effect, is taking responsibility for making sure that the suppliers get paid. Okay, now they can do that in the beginning, but I mean, you can't just have the central government's balance sheet being put at risk. If we're going to, at the moment, we are 10% of our electricity is solar or solar and wind. In another 40 years, that should become 70%. So the point really is that whilst these mechanisms can bring in people and demonstrate that if you have a reasonable assurance of payment, people will come, I mean, the system has to become self-sustaining so that you don't need these government support. And that is really going to be, that's what we mean by reforming the distribution system. And probably in order to get governments to reform distribution systems, a lot of investment has to be done to upgrade the distribution systems. And those can be standard multilateral lending for the power sector, which sort of leverages a whole lot of reform. So a mixture of all kinds of things is really needed.
Thank you. Any remarks that you would like to make? We are coming towards the end of this.
No, I guess speaking here from India, I will take the optimistic side. The pace of the energy I see here in terms of growing, particularly solar energy, wind, bio, hydrogen. The conversations here are very different to the conversations I had only three years ago when I was here before. And so the energy commitment here. And so this is what the world needs to see. As I said before, we know how to achieve this. We do know how to do this. There are cost premiums at the moment. I think many of those cost premiums will naturally fall as we achieve scale, as we achieve, we can start to standardize, we can do mass manufacturing of different technologies. And so it feels like the opportunity is there, it's possible to do, but there are significant headwinds as we were talking about it. And I think the onus is on all of us. And as I was saying, I think BP, in terms of its role as both an energy producer, but also as a voice within the energy sector, continue to play our role. But also, importantly, amazing think tanks like CSEP to play their role in terms of making sure that we keep this at the forefront of people's minds.
Thank you. Ahluwalia?
No, I thoroughly endorse this somewhat optimistic, but you need to be, you need to be optimistic. If you wanted to find problems, there's a huge list of problems. But I think the point that Spencer made, the difference between 3 years ago, this is very marked. Because wherever you go, people are talking about, there's nothing that isn't being put forward globally as part of the solution, which doesn't figure somewhere or the other in India. Ranging all the way from bio, solar, etc., green hydrogen, the works, even batteries and so on. We just have to walk the talk. It's relatively easy to do the talk. The problem is in some areas, even the talk isn't happening. And those areas are energy pricing. Are we going to achieve what by any standards is going to be a humongous transformation in the energy sector with no change, as he rightly said, in relative prices? If there's a way of changing relative prices without changing absolute prices, then somebody ought to lay out how that's going to happen. But that's what's not in the discussion so far. And I think personally it needs to be brought in. Because otherwise, it just means that you expect the fiscal side to take the hit. We've done a bit of that, lowering taxes. In the UK, you're having a leadership contest going on, and I believe one of the critical issues is that one of the candidates says we can't lower taxes right now, but the others say, no, you should cut taxes. So cutting taxes is too popular. You have the same problem in the United States. So how are we going to get that done? Unless these things get put back on the public agenda, and more importantly, people understand that this is necessary, it's going to be difficult for politicians to push this forward.
Thank you. I must say this has been a very quite an invigorating and interesting discussion. At CSEP, we have been working on all aspects of climate change and sustainability on this perspective related to energy change, energy transition, on discoms, on how coal power is going to give way to renewable energy. And we promise to bring you a whole range of such conversations and also, of course, research. So thank you, Mr. Dale, and thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. Thank you.